Adrian Ellis walked into the charity gala, immersed in the luxurious atmosphere, bathed in the golden light that illuminated the vast space. Everything was perfect. The laughter of guests blended with the soft background music, the clinking of glasses, and cheerful conversations filled with optimism. Everyone was laughing, enjoying exquisite food, and sharing stories of success and charitable campaigns. The warm atmosphere enveloping the event made everyone feel relaxed and happy. However, Adrian felt different. A vague sense of unease crept into his heart, as if something was wrong, lingering in the air, though he couldn't explain why. He walked through each corner of the room, his eyes passing over familiar faces, but not stopping. Despite the event taking place in such a beautiful setting, he couldn't feel the warmth he usually did. Everything around him seemed to fade away, each laugh, each conversation, seeming detached from him. He had attended countless parties like this, but he had never felt this way before. Everything around him seemed to spin, unclear, unreal. As he passed the bar area, his gaze suddenly froze. A little boy, about 3 years old, stood alone nearby, watching everything around him intently. But it was the boy's eyes that made Adrian stop. Those eyes, round and deep, full of curiosity but also innocence, were exactly like his own. Adrian suddenly realized that those eyes, that look, seemed to reflect his own. A strange sensation overtook him, and everything around him seemed to pause. The sounds, the lights in the room, suddenly felt distant, as if time had stopped when he and the boy exchanged a gaze. Adrian stood still, his heart pounding, an inexplicable but intense connection spreading through him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't take his eyes off the boy. It felt as though a deep secret, something unsolved, was surrounding him. The sensation was so powerful that he couldn't do anything except stand there, staring at the eyes so much like his own. Time seemed to stop, everything becoming blurry, leaving only the boy and him, as if an invisible thread connected them. He couldn't explain it. He didn't understand why the boy made him feel a desire he couldn't comprehend, a deep curiosity that he couldn't ignore. This strange connection wasn't something Adrian could easily accept in his mind. He had been to countless parties, met countless people, but this feeling of seeing a part of himself in the eyes of a child he had never met, had never happened before. Though the boy didn't seem special, those eyes carried a profound message that he couldn't ignore. How could there be such a coincidence? Why did the boy look so much like him? Thoughts began to swirl in Adrian's mind. The sensation made him uncomfortable, confused. He wanted to find answers, wanted to understand what was happening to him. But he couldn't. He couldn't take his eyes off the boy. Everything around him started to blur, leaving only the image of the boy and Adrian's gaze. In that moment, Adrian felt that his life, with all its glamour and busyness, had perhaps been missing something important that he had never noticed before. A longing that had not been satisfied, something missing that he didn't know how to face. The boy's gaze was like a mirror reflecting the past, reflecting a part of Adrian that he had tried to hide. He couldn't fully comprehend this, but a strange, inexplicable feeling kept him rooted to the spot. Questions began to surface in his mind, questions he had never thought of before. Who was this boy? Why did his eyes look so much like his own? That was the moment everything began to change. The moment Adrian knew that his life was about to take a path he had never imagined. This strange coincidence would lead him to a truth he could never have expected. Adrian stood still before the truth he had just discovered. The strange connection with little Max was something that couldn't be explained by reason. It wasn't just a simple coincidence. It was a deep feeling that he couldn't ignore. The boy's eyes made him hesitate, as if every memory buried in the past suddenly rushed back. Faint images of a life left behind, wrong decisions, times when he turned his back on the most important things in his life. Something in Max's eyes made Adrian unable to continue living in the safe shell he had created for himself. A rising sense of doubt overwhelmed him. Why had he abandoned Sophie and the unborn child? Why had he chosen his career and freedom, leaving loneliness for someone he had once loved? Adrian couldn't answer those questions. The memories of the painful days when he decided to turn his back on Sophie and those family dreams haunted him, as if they had always been chasing him from the past up to this very moment. He couldn't deny his responsibility, couldn't stop thinking about what he had done. The context now was the painful confrontation between two completely different worlds. In a dark corner of the party, where the lights didn't shine, Sophie stood there. She was like a ghost in the shadows, cold and full of anger. Her gaze towards Adrian was filled with disappointment. 3 years had passed since they last met, but her feelings seemed as fresh as ever. She still hadn't forgotten the betrayal. She couldn't forget Adrian's silence when she needed him the most, when she was carrying his child without any companionship. The feeling of loneliness when she was pregnant with Max, facing all the pain and fear without the man who had promised to share everything with her. When Sophie's eyes met Adrian's, everything seemed to slow down. She couldn't understand why she felt this way. Why was she still angry with him after all these years? Why couldn't she relax? Why couldn't she forgive him, even though she had tried so hard to build her life on her own? She couldn't forget the betrayal, the abandonment Adrian had given her. That feeling was like a scar in her heart, and no matter how much time passed, that wound could never heal. Every time she thought about those months, about the loneliness she felt while pregnant with Max and Adrian's coldness, the pain came back stronger than ever. Every memory flared up, pulling her into a vortex she couldn't escape from. Sophie felt torn inside. She knew her son needed to know about his father, that Max had the right to know the man who created him. But she couldn't simply forgive and forget the hurt Adrian had caused. She wanted to protect Max, to shield her son from the painful emotions she had endured. She didn't want her son to face a man who didn't deserve him. But at the same time, she also knew that hiding the truth would do no one any good. Max needed a family, and in her mind, that was an internal struggle she couldn't avoid. The torn feeling made Sophie unable to make a decision immediately. She wanted to give up everything, to live in peace with the old memories, but she couldn't do that. The truth couldn't be hidden forever. Every day, as Max grew older, questions would gradually appear, and someday the boy would have to know about his father. But could Sophie face Adrian without feeling pain? Could she accept that everything had changed? That there was no longer any reason to keep blaming Adrian forever? The feeling of helplessness and pain in Sophie's heart was like a shadow enveloping her. She couldn't overlook Adrian's mistakes, but she couldn't keep living in the past either. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say when facing the man she had once loved, but also been abandoned by in the most difficult situation. The unanswered questions kept spinning in her mind. Could old love heal all wounds? Or was it just a painful memory that could never be forgotten? She didn't know, but one thing she was certain of was that, whether she forgave him or not, nothing would ever be the same again. Adrian couldn't escape the image of Max. Every time the boy appeared within his sight, he felt something that couldn't be explained. Emotions he wasn't prepared for. An urge to understand this boy weighed heavily on him. Like a call from the past he couldn't ignore. He couldn't express this, but the feeling, a deep, strange, yet undeniable connection, surrounded him. Every time he looked into Max's clear eyes, memories that had been buried suddenly came alive, and questions about his own past, the boy's mother, and even himself kept emerging. He didn't realize it at first, but something in Max's gaze made his heart race. It wasn't just the look of a child. It was his own gaze, reflected in a tiny form. Just looking into those eyes, Adrian felt as if he was transported back to the days he had left behind. Max was a part of him, a part he had forgotten for so long. That connection, though invisible, was so strong it was inexplicable. Adrian began trying to get closer to Max, wanting to know the boy in a way he had never done with anyone else. He didn't know where to start, didn't know what to say to a child he didn't even know. But he couldn't stand still. The urge inside him was too powerful. He wanted to understand the boy, to know if Max felt anything about him, even though he knew this was a complicated and painful relationship. He began approaching Max with small gestures, gentle actions that didn't put pressure on the boy. He played with him, sometimes helped him when needed, and each time he did, he felt a vague but very real connection. Every smile from Max, every look from him made Adrian's heart flutter. However, that feeling wasn't just joy, but deep concern. Would the boy recognize him as his father? Would he love him as a real father? Or just see him as a stranger, a new face in his life? This anxiety prevented Adrian from stopping his thoughts about himself, about the mistakes he had made. When Adrian looked at Max, he didn't just see a child, but a part of a life he had missed. He realized he had never fully embraced the role of a father. Through the passing years, he had been consumed with work and personal passions, never thinking about who he had left behind. He had never really stopped to think about his son, never really faced the responsibility of being a father. Now, standing before Max, he felt the cost of that negligence, and it caused him pain. The memories of the time he had abandoned Sophie and the unborn child seemed to come back with devastating force. The days he had left her, the decisions he had thought were right, but had made Sophie and Max's life more difficult, all hit him like a violent wave crashing into his heart. The guilt and regret surged. He couldn't change the past, but he couldn't stop thinking about the things he had overlooked. As Adrian tried to understand Max, he also realized that he didn't just want to understand the boy. He wanted to rediscover a part of himself he had lost. He wanted to make up for the shortcomings of the past, to prove that he could do better, that he could be a true father to Max. But fear held him back. He was afraid that all his efforts would only hurt Sophie more, the woman he had once loved and also the one he had abandoned. Would his presence in Max's life reopen old wounds for Sophie? Could he heal the pain he had caused? The anxiety never stopped chasing Adrian. He wanted to make Max feel comfortable, but didn't want to do anything that would make the boy uncomfortable. He didn't know what to do to avoid causing Sophie more hurt. Every action, every gesture, every word was carefully thought out, but he couldn't escape the tension. He couldn't help but worry about the consequences his decisions might bring. All these thoughts weren't easy for Adrian. His relationship with Max, a relationship that had never existed, had now become a challenge he couldn't solve overnight. The fear of hurting both Max and Sophie at the same time hung over him like a cloud, overshadowing all his thoughts. He wanted to find the right path, but at the same time, he felt as if he was standing on the edge of a deep abyss where there was no easy return. The strange connection between him and Max was something he couldn't understand, but it was the only thing that gave him a little hope in these troubled days. The atmosphere of the charity party was still filled with joy, but Adrian couldn't break free from the heavy thoughts weighing on his mind. He continued to sneak glances at Max, the boy happily playing with those around him. His thoughts were still chaotic, unable to explain why he felt like there was some special connection with the boy. Why Max? Why did those eyes make him feel like part of him was living in the body of a small child? But just as these questions couldn't find an answer, the truth he had always avoided suddenly surged forward like a wave crashing unexpectedly. Sophie, standing in a corner of the room not far away, saw Adrian not taking his eyes off Max. It had been a long time since she had faced this man, and each step she took felt soaked in old memories. She knew she couldn't stay silent forever. The emotions that had been suppressed for 3 years now burst forth strongly. Sophie couldn't hide what she had been keeping inside. And now, at this lavish party, As the lights reflected the images of happiness, she felt the need to speak the truth. Even though this moment had come too soon, she couldn't bear it any longer. Couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine, that everything had passed. The feelings of anger and disappointment made her lose control, and Sophie walked toward Adrian. As she got closer to him, everything seemed to stop in the stillness of the room, leaving only the sound of both of their breaths. She looked at him, then at Max, and in that moment her decision had been made. "Max is your son," Sophie said, her voice catching. The words struck like lightning into the bright atmosphere of the party, making everything around her fade into a blur, silence taking over. She looked into Adrian's eyes, unable to read what was going on in his mind. She didn't expect this moment to come so soon, but she had no other choice. She needed him to know the truth, even though it would disrupt everything, even though it would reopen old wounds that both of them had tried to forget. Adrian stood frozen, unable to comprehend what Sophie had just said. He couldn't believe his ears, as if part of him couldn't accept this truth. His son? The child he had been watching, the child he couldn't take his eyes off, was the very son he had left behind in the past. The truth hit him like a slap in the face, making everything around him seem to move backward. Old images, wrong decisions. The days he had turned his back on Sophie and their unborn child now came rushing back like a fierce flood. The feeling of disbelief enveloped Adrian. He couldn't think straight, couldn't accept that Max, the child he had never known, was his son. The feeling was like a pain that could not be put into words. Everything he had left behind in the past, everything he had run away from, was now crashing down on him. Every moment, every decision, every time he walked away and left those he loved behind, all of it now felt like a wave crashing into his heart. Regret surged within Adrian, so strong that he couldn't control it. He didn't know how to face this truth. He couldn't change the past, but the pain of the years he had missed continued to haunt him. The child he didn't know, the child he had carelessly abandoned, was now standing right in front of him. Adrian felt as though his entire body was being bound by this pain, and in that moment, he understood that his mistakes had come at a very high price. The choking emotion left him unable to speak. He looked at Sophie, then back at Max, as if the two were reflecting in his eyes. He wanted to apologize, wanted to say all the words of regret in his heart, but couldn't. The words seemed to be stuck on his lips, as all the emotions piled up, as everything he had missed in his life suddenly came flooding back. Sophie saw the pain in Adrian's eyes, but she couldn't go back to the past. The years that had passed, the pain she had endured, couldn't be erased in an instant. But she knew that a part of her heart also felt lighter because at last, the truth had been revealed. Sophie didn't need to hide anymore. She looked at Adrian, her eyes full of disappointment but also not lacking in determination. Adrian stood there, shocked, stunned, but also unable to escape the truth he had just heard. Every thought, every question, every emotion inside him collided, making it impossible for him to continue pretending everything was okay. The child he had seen, the one he felt an extraordinary connection to, was his son. And now, he had to face that truth. Adrian stood by the window, looking out without seeing anything. The scenery outside could be beautiful, but in his heart, it was just a foggy blur. He couldn't shake the thoughts of Max, the times he had seen the boy, those eyes he couldn't forget. Every time he looked into those eyes, he felt as if everything in his life was being turned upside down. Max, a child he had just met, made him feel as though he had missed an important part of his life. The long days spent in the whirlwind of work, projects, distant travels, dull meetings, and flashy parties hadn't fulfilled him. He had spent too much time chasing things that weren't truly important. And now, facing Max, he realized that the things he had considered success, the things he believed would bring him happiness, could not fill the emptiness he felt inside. When he sat down in the room, where soft light fell upon his face, everything seemed to stop. Max's gaze, the innocence in his eyes, made Adrian's heart ache. Max didn't know about his past, about abandonment, about the wrong decisions he had made. The boy simply looked at him as a friend, a stranger he could play with. But in those eyes, Adrian saw an invisible connection, a bond he couldn't explain. He continued to spend time with Max, despite the worries in his heart. Every time he tried to talk to the boy, help him, even though Max didn't know who he was, Adrian could feel that closeness. Every time the boy smiled, every time Max played and accidentally looked his way, Adrian's heart would skip a beat. He felt like he was living in a dream, where nothing could be undone. He had wasted so much precious time, and now, seeing Max, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of regret. Adrian knew that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't change the mistakes he had made. Couldn't go back to the time before he decided to leave, abandoning Sophie and their child. But the truth was, he had missed all those precious moments, the opportunities to love and care for his family. Time had passed and could not be reclaimed. And now, when he faced Max, he felt an enormous burden. The boy was just an innocent child, unaware of the pain and the void he had caused in his family. But with every glance at the boy, Adrian felt the pain in his heart grow larger. This anxiety became even stronger as Adrian became more aware of himself. He began questioning the decisions in his life. Why had he ignored his family, ignored the people he loved, to pursue what he thought was a career, success? He wondered if what he had done was worth it, when now he had to face the consequences of that absence. He had missed Max, missed Sophie, missed those important moments of life that he could never get back. Those moments were now just memories, painful memories he couldn't erase. He looked at Max, at the innocent eyes, and realized that he had never been a true father. Every time the boy looked at him, Adrian felt a pain that words couldn't describe. Every time Max smiled, he felt a pang of guilt, a regret for having missed so much time that he should have spent with him. Now, when everything had changed, he realized that family was the most important thing, that nothing was more precious than the love and care of family. Every time he spent time playing with Max, he felt a deep connection. The boy didn't know that he was his son, but Adrian felt an incredibly strong affection. As the days passed, Adrian felt like he was slowly reconnecting with Max, even though the boy didn't recognize him as his father. The hugs, the hand-holding during walks, the hours of playing together, all of these made Adrian feel like he was living in a love he had missed. But the closer he got to Max, the more regret he felt. He couldn't get back the time he had lost, couldn't go back to the past and redo everything he had missed. These emotions grew increasingly repressed inside him. He wanted to do better, wanted to be the father that Max deserved, but the fear and guilt couldn't be easily shaken off. He didn't know what to do to make up for those shortcomings. But deep down, he understood that only time could help him fix his mistakes. He had to prove to Max that he could be the father the boy needed, that he could do better. Adrian felt like he was standing at an important crossroads. He couldn't continue living in regret, couldn't keep sinking into those feelings of guilt. He had to stand up and do something to change. The days ahead would be a difficult journey, full of challenges, but Adrian couldn't turn back. He had to fight against himself, face the shortcomings of his past, and not let them control his life anymore. And though each day was a struggle, Adrian knew that this was the only way he could find peace in his soul, and most importantly, rebuild his relationship with Max so that the boy wouldn't have to grow up without the love of a father. That night, after the party, Adrian couldn't sleep. The images of Max kept haunting his mind, and thoughts of the past wouldn't stop circling in his head. He couldn't shake the heavy feeling, as if he was trapped in a vortex with no way out. Everything now seemed hazy and painful. He looked at the phone on the table but couldn't bring himself to text or call Sophie. Perhaps it was too late for anything to change. But he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. At this moment, Sophie was the only one he could face. The only one who could help him release the pain that was boiling inside him. Finally, he decided to call her, not to start over, but simply to understand what she had been through all these years. Sophie answered the phone reluctantly. She had promised herself she wouldn't engage with Adrian again. But his words that night, the truth he had to face, made her feel like she couldn't ignore it any longer. She knew that facing him now, even the hardest things, was a way to free herself. 3 years had passed, and nothing could hurt her any further. The wounds in her heart had become so deep, they had formed thick, solid layers. When Adrian arrived at Sophie's house, he saw her standing by the window, looking out with a distant gaze. Nights like this, he still remembered. The two of them used to stand together, sharing things they couldn't say out loud. Now, everything was different. There were no bright lights, no laughter, just untold stories and unspoken pain. Sophie turned to look at Adrian, her eyes cold but determined. "You want to know about the past 3 years?" she asked, her tone flat. Adrian nodded, his heart tightening as he saw her expression. Sophie hadn't changed much, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't predict. It was waiting, disappointment, but also the strength she had built up over the years. Adrian couldn't speak right away. He just stood there, silently, waiting for Sophie to tell him about what she had endured. And she began to speak, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she knew this was the last time they had to face each other, to say everything in order to release themselves. "Do you know," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly, "the past 3 years have been full of hardship for me. You have no idea. I had to do everything alone. Every day was a battle to ensure Max had a good life, even without a father. The feeling of not being able to share that burden with anyone, the feeling of loneliness every night when Max sleeps, it ate me up bit by bit." She paused for a moment, looking into Adrian's eyes. Her gaze didn't carry anger, but only exhaustion and pain. "You can't understand what it's like to raise a child without the help of the man who abandoned me. You weren't there for the most important moments. You don't know what it's like for a mother to worry about her child and work to make money, all on her own. Max wasn't just missing a father, he was also missing the care, the love that you should have given him." Adrian listened to every word Sophie spoke, every story she shared, and he felt like he was being pushed into an abyss. Each word was like a final blow, striking his heart. He couldn't say anything, couldn't apologize, couldn't justify himself. Everything she said was the truth, and that truth was a cruelty he couldn't deny. "Max has asked about you many times," Sophie continued, her voice growing softer, as if letting go of the heavy burden in her heart. "He's felt your absence. Max doesn't understand why his father isn't there, why you don't love him. He doesn't know that you chose to abandon us to chase your ambitions. He just knows that he's missing a father." Sophie's words hit Adrian hard. He had known he had missed out on so much, but hearing Sophie speak of Max's emotions, he couldn't hold back the guilt that surged inside him. He couldn't deny that his absence had not only affected Sophie, but had also been a huge loss for Max. A loss that now he could never make up for. Max had grown up without his father, and now, looking at the boy, Adrian realized that his absence had created an irreparable wound. Max hadn't just lacked his presence, he had also lacked the opportunities Adrian had missed. Moments he should have been there, witnessing his son grow, instead of leaving him to face the world on his own. Adrian could no longer hold back. The guilt and regret surged in him, and he wanted to say everything. But the words got stuck in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to make everything go back to how it was, but he knew that was impossible. Time couldn't go backward. The years he had missed couldn't be reclaimed. All he had left was regret and an emptiness in his heart. "I'm sorry," Adrian said, his voice weak, but full of sincerity. "I don't know what to do to fix my mistakes. I can't change the past, but I will try to do everything I can to make it up to Max, to you." Sophie looked at him without saying a word, silently observing him. She hadn't expected an apology, but the sincerity in Adrian's eyes made her feel the change in him. However, no matter how much he regretted it, what had happened couldn't be changed. Sophie didn't know if she could forgive Adrian, but she also understood that only time and real actions would prove his remorse. "Only actions can prove everything," Sophie said, her voice firm. "You can't change the past, but if you want to be Max's father, you have to start now. Don't let the boy grow up without you any longer." Sophie's words weren't just a warning, they were also a deep reminder for Adrian. He knew that if he wanted to change, if he truly wanted to be a father to Max, he had to prove it with actions, not just words. But the tragic truth he had just heard about the past years, about the losses he had caused, left him unsure of how to make up for everything. When Sophie ended the conversation, Adrian felt like he had been stripped bare, with nothing left to hide. His absence hadn't just affected Sophie, but had also been a profound loss for Max. The guilt and regret still lingered within him, and now he understood that no matter what he did, he couldn't turn back time. Adrian stood on the balcony, his eyes gazing toward the horizon, where the last light of the day painted the sky golden. The scene before him seemed unable to soothe the turmoil in his heart. His pulse raced, as if preparing for a pivotal moment in his life. He couldn't ignore the feelings of guilt, the thoughts swirling around the decision he had to make. The sense of remorse never left him, like a haunting shadow, lingering every second. He knew that to salvage everything, he had to face himself, confront the mistakes of his past. No one could fully understand the internal struggle Adrian was enduring. He had lived a life chasing vague goals, neglecting true values. His wrong decisions about his career, his family, and his responsibilities had now resurfaced, pushing him onto a path with no turning back. He couldn't deny his past, but he couldn't let it control his future either. He had to change, but how could he start over? All he wanted was to make it right for Max, for Sophie. But how could he do that when he himself was the one who had caused the deep wounds in their hearts? He couldn't erase the past, couldn't turn back time, but he knew that if he didn't act now, everything would forever remain an unchangeable regret. And then he made his decision. Adrian walked into the room where Sophie and Max were sitting. Everything around him seemed to fall silent, leaving only the sound of his rapid breathing. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, as if the whole space was waiting for a life-changing decision. Max looked at him with innocent eyes, unaware that he was standing before a choice that would alter the lives of all three of them. Sophie looked up at him, her face thoughtful, saying nothing. She knew what was coming. She had known that Adrian couldn't live in the past forever. He had to face his mistakes and find a way to make amends. Adrian looked into Sophie's eyes. He didn't know what to say. Apologies, explanations, none of that mattered anymore. He had said too much, and now it was time to prove it through actions. He knew that there was no easy way forward, and redemption couldn't happen in a single moment. But he couldn't keep standing still, couldn't keep avoiding his responsibilities. "You were right," Adrian said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've missed so much, not just with you, but with Max. I can't change the past, but I will try to start over. I won't miss it anymore. I'll be the father that Max deserves, and I'll be the partner that you need." His words echoed in the room, soft yet firm. A decision had been made, but it wasn't an easy change. Adrian knew this would face resistance. It wouldn't shift in just one night. But at least he could now look Sophie in the eye, look at Max, and say what he had been searching for all this time. Sophie looked at him, her eyes still unchanged. She wasn't quick to trust, not eager to give him another chance. Adrian's words, no matter how sincere, weren't enough to heal the wounds he had caused. She wanted to believe that he could start over. But could he? Was he truly ready to change? Those questions still lingered in her heart. But at least she could see that he was truly trying to begin again. Max looked on innocently, not fully understanding everything, just seeing two adults looking at each other with emotions that couldn't be expressed. The boy still didn't recognize the complexity of the situation, still didn't fully understand it, but in his eyes, Adrian was the father he had always hoped for. The moments of joy when he played with Adrian, the times when he felt the closeness, were all that he knew. But for Adrian, those were the precious moments he had missed. Simple things, yet incredibly valuable. Adrian knelt in front of Max, saying nothing, letting his emotions flood. He wanted to say that he was his father, that he would never abandon him again. But in that moment, he didn't need to say anything. Max only needed to know that he would always be there, never leaving. Without words, Adrian sensed that the closeness, the tenderness, would be what Max needed more than anything else. After a moment of silence, Sophie spoke. "You have to prove it, not just with words. You won't be able to go back to the past, but if you want to start over, you have to begin with your actions." Her voice was gentle but resolute. She looked at Adrian, not with anger, but with fragile hope. "I can't keep living in the shadow of the past. You have to act. You have to show Max that you can be a father, a true partner." Adrian nodded. Sophie's words were a strong reminder. He couldn't just talk. He couldn't merely say he would change. Instead, he had to prove it with every action, starting with the smallest steps, from becoming an essential part of Max's life. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. Ready to face himself, ready to fix his mistakes, not just for himself, but for his family. Max looked up at him with bright eyes, eyes still full of innocence and hope. Adrian felt a wave of strong emotions, an invisible bond between him and the boy. It was a connection he had lost over the years. He couldn't get it all back. But from this moment on, he could do everything to become the person Max needed. The three of them stood there, in a space filled with silence, but also with hope. Adrian knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. He would face many challenges. He would have to prove to Sophie and Max that he could do it, that he could become the person they deserved. But at least he had made his decision. He had taken a decisive step, and that was the most important thing. In that moment, Adrian felt an unusual peace. He no longer felt the weight he once had, no longer felt the torment of the past. He was ready for a new chapter in his life, ready to face the challenges ahead, and most importantly, he was ready to become a true father to Max. Years passed, and gradually, peace found its way back into the lives of Adrian and Sophie. It wasn't an easy process, but it was a journey they had to go through together, step by step. For Adrian, everything had changed. He no longer viewed the world through the lens of career ambitions and personal desires. Instead, he clearly saw that family love was the most important thing in life, the lasting value he had missed for so long. This was the profound realization he had found, not through theory or advice from others, but through his own tearful experiences. Adrian began to realize that, although he couldn't change the past, he could correct the future. He couldn't go back to the moments he had lost, but he could act now to make things right, to reclaim what he had let slip away. He understood that being a father wasn't a simple role, but a great responsibility, and he was ready to embrace it. Every day, he tried to do his best for Max, to be a sincere father, striving to become the role model the boy needed. Sophie, although still holding on to some doubts, gradually opened up more. She couldn't forget the hurts from the past, but she also couldn't deny that Adrian had changed. He was no longer the indifferent man she had once known. He had faced his mistakes, accepted responsibility, and was making an effort every day to make up for the losses. The change in him wasn't a magical transformation, but a slow, persistent change. Though the wounds in her heart hadn't fully healed, the love and redemption Adrian brought had somewhat soothed them. As each day passed, the connection between Adrian and Sophie grew stronger. Although there had been doubts at first, the feelings between them were slowly mended. Sophie began to feel the sincerity in Adrian's actions, in the way he cared for Max, in his effort to be a good father. She didn't need him to be perfect. She just needed to see the truth in his heart. Gradually, that was enough to open her heart and allow them to find their way back together. One autumn afternoon, as the warm, golden sunlight streamed through the window, Sophie and Adrian sat together without needing to say anything, simply feeling each other's presence. Max played in the room next door, his laughter echoing in the warm space. It was a moment when both of them understood they had overcome many challenges, and now they had found the path to walk together. Adrian looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with regret, but also full of hope. "I know it's not easy for you to forgive the past," he said, his voice softening. "But I hope that one day you'll see that I did everything for this family, for Max, for you." Sophie looked at him, her gaze gentler than before. "You've changed," she replied, "and that's what matters most. We can't live forever in the past, Adrian. We need to look toward the future." Sophie's words were like an acknowledgement, a forgiveness that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Although the pain from the past couldn't be erased in an instant, at least they had found forgiveness and acceptance for each other. A new life had begun, one where the past was no longer a burden, and love, forgiveness, was the key to rebuilding everything. Max ran into the room, his eyes sparkling when he saw his parents sitting together. The boy didn't understand everything, but he could feel the peace in the air. That was all he needed: unconditional love, the protection from his parents. Adrian reached out, pulling Max into his arms, and looked at Sophie. It was a moment when he knew he had done the right thing, that he had brought his family back together, even though the journey hadn't been easy. With each passing day, their small family gradually found happiness again. The relationship between Adrian and Sophie was not a perfect story, but it was a story about forgiveness, about love that didn't give up. And most importantly, it was a story about starting over, about redemption, about realizing that sometimes only love and sincerity can help us overcome the pain and losses of the past. In the end, this story wasn't just about a man trying to redeem his mistakes, but also about the power of love and forgiveness. No matter how painful the past was, no matter how hard to heal wounds there were, if we can face ourselves, if we can face the ones we love and are willing to change, we can still start over. We can still find the true values of life. And sometimes, it is our mistakes and forgiveness that help us become stronger, help us grow, and ultimately, help us find the true path to happiness. One spring afternoon, as the warm sunlight began to bathe the space in golden hues, Adrian stood by the window of the small house he had spent months renovating, creating a cozy, love-filled place for his family. He looked outside, feeling the peace within himself that he hadn't been able to find for a long time. Finally, after all the turmoil and mistakes, he had been given a second chance, and this time he would not waste it. Sophie sat beside him, her hand tightly holding his, her gaze sweeping over the vast sky in front of them. Neither of them needed to say anything more. Words no longer mattered. The love and understanding they shared were enough. In that moment, they had overcome the struggles of the past. The wounds, though still present, had begun to heal. Their small family had started to rebuild a strong foundation to step into the future. A future where, even though the past couldn't be changed, it would be an opportunity to create new memories, nurture love and forgiveness, and make up for the lost moments. Max ran into the room, his eyes sparkling, and the sound of his laughter filled the air like a beautiful melody, easing away all the tension and worries in Adrian and Sophie's hearts. The boy sat beside them, his small hands reaching up to seek warmth. Adrian smiled and hugged Max, the warmth of the embrace spreading through his heart. He knew he had found a part of life that he had lost, and now he would never let it slip away again. "Thank you for coming back," Sophie whispered, her her eyes looking at Adrian with determination and love. "Thank you for starting over. We've made it through the hardest parts." Adrian nodded, gently patting Max's head. "We can't change the past, but we can build a new future," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I will do everything I can to keep this family happy." In that moment, they were no longer haunted by the mistakes of the past. No more unhealed wounds. Instead, they were a family beginning a new journey, where love and forgiveness were the solid foundation to build everything on. The story of Adrian and Sophie wasn't a fairy tale. They didn't live in a perfect world where everything was beautiful and there were no difficulties. They had faced failures, losses, and pain. But it was those very things that helped them realize the true value of love, family, and forgiveness. Even though the past still lingered, they had learned to live with it, not allowing it to dominate their present and future. Sophie rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, and he gently hugged her, feeling the peace and happiness they had found together. In that moment, all three of them, Adrian, Sophie, and Max, felt that they had overcome all the challenges, faced the pain, and had learned to love each other once again. Though they could not change the past, they understood that what mattered most was how they faced the present and future, how they rebuilt their relationship from the wounds, from the regrets, to create new happy memories, moments of reunion and love. Adrian looked into Sophie's eyes, then at Max, his eyes filled with love. He had been on a long journey, full of mistakes and wrong decisions, but now he knew that family was the one thing he could not live without. Family was where he found peace, where all mistakes could be forgiven, and where love could heal all wounds. There was nothing more important than being with the people he loved, to build a bright future together, and that is the message their story wanted to convey. Though we cannot change the past, we always have the power to choose how to build a new future. Mistakes don't define us, but how we correct them and face them is what matters most. Love and forgiveness are the forces that help us overcome every hardship and challenge in life. And when we can forgive ourselves and others, we will find peace in our hearts and a path to true happiness ahead. The story ends not with flowery words or empty promises, but with true change through actions and dedication. Adrian, Sophie, and Max had found the revival of their family, and they knew that, though there were many challenges ahead, as long as they had each other, they would overcome everything. Because love is the only force that can heal all wounds, and it is the eternal flame that will guide them through every difficulty in life. All three of them sat together in silence, but without needing to say anything more. They had found the answer in that peaceful moment. A reunited family, a family with love and forgiveness, was ready to start a new chapter in their lives.